Hey guys, welcome back. Just a reminder, this is being shared with permission from Scholastic and will be taken down in June. We're going to start off with our riddle of the day. Remember, the riddle of the day from yesterday was, what has a bottom at the top? The answer is legs. Your riddle of the day for today is, I am an odd number. Take away a letter and I become even. What number am I? I'll read that again because it's kind of big. I am an odd number. Take away a letter and I become even. What number am I? I'm going to leave that there for you guys to think about. Just a reminder, we're reading chapters 29 and 30 today from the book Uglies. Chapter 29 is called Bravery. And this is the chapter where we find out if Tally actually tells David or if she lied to Shay. All right, Bravery. That night at dinner she ate alone. Now that she'd spent a day cutting trees herself, the wooden table at the dining hall no longer horrified her. The grain of the wood felt reassuringly solid, and tracing its whorls with her eyes was easier than thinking. For the first time Tally noticed the sameness of the food. Bread again, stew again. A couple days ago Shay had explained that the plump meat in the stew was rabbit, not soy-based, like the dehydrated meat in her spag bowl, but real animals from the overcrowded pen on the edge of the smoke. The thought of rabbits being killed, skinned, and cooked suited her mood. Like the rest of her day, this meal tasted brutal and serious. Shay hadn't talked to her after lunch, and Tally had no idea what to say to Croy, so she worked the rest of the day in silence. Dr. Cable's pendant seemed to grow heavier and heavier, wound across her neck as tightly as vines, brush, and roots grasping at the railroad tracks. It felt as if everyone in the smoke could see what the necklace really was, a symbol of her treachery. Tally wondered if she could ever stay there now. Croy suspected what she was, and it seemed like it would be only a matter of time before everyone else knew. All day long a terrible thought had kept crossing her mind. Maybe the smoke was where she really belonged, and she'd lost her chance by going there as a spy. And now Tally had come between David and Shay. Without even trying, she'd shafted her best friend. Like walking poison, she killed everything. She thought of the orchids spreading across the plains below, choking the life out of other plants, out of the soil itself, selfish and unstoppable. Tally Youngblood was a weed, and unlike the orchids, she wasn't even a pretty one. Just as she finished eating, David sat down across from her. Hey, hi, she managed. Despite everything, it was a relief to see him. Eating alone had reminded her of the days after her birthday, trapped as an ugly when everyone knew she should be pretty. Today was the first time she'd felt like an ugly since coming to the smoke. David reached across and took her hand. Hallie, I'm sorry. You're sorry? He turned her palm up to reveal her freshly blistered fingers. I noticed that you didn't wear the gloves, not after you had lunch with Shay. It wasn't hard to guess why. Oh, yeah. It's not that I didn't like them. I just couldn't. Sure, I know. This is all my fault. He looked around the crowded hall. Can we get out of here? I've got something to tell you. Callie nodded, feeling the cold pendant against her neck and remembering her promise to Shay. Yeah, I've got something to tell you too. They walked through the smoke, past cook fires being extinguished with shovelfuls of dirt, and windows coming alight with candles and electric bulbs, and a handful of young uglies pursuing an escaped chicken. They climbed the ridge from which Tally had first looked down on the settlement, and David led her along to a cool, flat outcrop of stone, where a view opened up between the trees. As always, Tally noticed how graceful David was, how he seemed to know every step on the path intimately. Not even pretties, whose bodies were perfectly balanced, designed for elegance in every kind of clothing, moved with such effortless control. Tally deliberated, turning her eyes away from him. In the valley below, the orchids glowed with pale mele- the orchids glowed in the moonlight, a frozen sea against the dark shore of the forest. Tally stared. Sorry, missed that all though. David started talking first. Did you know you're the first runaway to come here all alone? Really? He nodded, still staring at the white expanse of flowers. Most of the time, I bring them in. Tally remembered Shay, the night they'd seen each other in the city, saying that the mysterious David would take her to the smoke. Back then, Tally had hardly believed there was such a person. Now sitting next to her, David seemed very real. He took the world more seriously than any other ugly she had ever met, even more seriously, in fact, than middle pretties like her parents. In a funny way, his eyes held the same intensity that the cruel pretties had, though without their coldness. My mother used to in the old days, he said, but now she is too old. Tally swallowed. They always explained in school how uglies who didn't have the operations eventually became infirm. Oh, I'm so sorry. How old is she, anyways? He laughed. She's plenty fit, but uglies have an easier time trusting someone like me, someone their own age. Oh, of course. Tally remembered her reaction to the boss the first day. Only a couple of weeks later, she was much more used to all the different kinds of faces that age created. Sometimes a few uglies will make it out on their own, following coded directions like you did, but it's always been 3 or 4 in a group. No one's ever come all alone. You must think I'm an idiot. Not at all. He took her hand. I think it was really brave. She shrugged. It wasn't that bad of a trip, really. It's not that the it's not the traveling that takes courage, Tally. I've done much longer trips on my own. It's leaving home. Traced a line on her sore hand with a finger. I can't imagine having to walk all the way from the smoke, away from everything I've ever known, realizing I'd probably never come back. Tally swallowed. It hadn't been easy. Of course, she hadn't really had a choice. But you left your city, the only place you'd ever lived, all alone, David continued. You hadn't even met a Smoky, someone to convince you firsthand that it was a real place. You did it all on trust, because your friend asked you. I guess that's why I feel I can trust you. Tally looked out at the weeds, feeling worse with every word David said. If only he knew the real reason she was there. When Shay first told me you were coming, I was really angry at her. Because I might have given the smoke away? Partly, and partly because it's really dangerous for a city-bred 16-year-old to cross hundreds of miles alone. But mostly, I thought it was a wasted risk, because you probably wouldn't even make it out of your dorm window. He looked at her, squeezing her hand softly. I was amazed when I saw you running down that hill. Tally smiled. I was a pretty sorry sight that day. You were so scratched up, your hair and clothes all singed from that fire, but you had the biggest smile on your face. David's face seemed to glow in the soft moonlight. Tally closed her eyes and shook her head. Great. She was going to get an award for bravery, when she should really be kicked out of the smoke for treachery. You don't look quite so happy now, though, he said softly. Not everyone thinks it's great that I came here. He laughed. Yeah, Corey told me about his big revelation. He did? She opened her eyes. Don't listen to him. From the moment you got here, he was suspicious about your coming alone. He thought you must have had help along the way. City help. But I told him he was crazy. Thanks. He shrugged. When you and Shay saw each other, you were so happy. I could tell that you'd really missed her. Yeah, I was worried about her. Of course you were. And you were brave enough to come looking yourself, even if it meant walking away from everything you'd ever known, alone. You didn't really come because you wanted to live in the smoke, did you? What do you mean? You came to see if Shay was all right. Tally looked into David's eyes. Even if he was completely wrong about her, it felt good to bask in his words. Up until now, the whole day had been tainted by suspicion and doubt, but David's face shone with admiration for what she had done. A feeling spread through her, a warmth that pushed away the cold wind cutting across the ridge. Then Tally trembled inside, realizing what the feeling was. This was the same warmth she'd felt after talking to Paris after his operation, or when the teachers looked at her with approval. It was not a feeling she'd ever gotten from an ugly before. Without large, perfectly shaped eyes, their faces couldn't make you feel that way. But the moonlight and the setting, or maybe just the words he was saying, had somehow turned David into a pretty. Just for a moment. But the magic was all based on lies. She didn't deserve the look in David's eyes. She turned to face the ocean of weeds again. I bet Shay wishes she never told me about the smoke. Maybe right now, maybe for a while, David said, but not forever. But you and she and I. He sighed. Shay changes her mind pretty quickly, you know? What do you mean? When she first wanted to come to the smoke back in the spring. The first time she wanted to come to the smoke was back in the spring, when Corey and the others came. She told me. She chickened out, right? David nodded. I always figured she would. She just wanted to run away because her friends were. If she stayed in the city, she'd be left all alone. Tally thought of her friendless days after Paris's operation. Yeah, I know that feeling. But she never showed up that night, which happens. I was really surprised to see her in the ruins a few weeks ago, suddenly convinced she wanted to leave the city forever. And she was already talking about bringing a friend, even though she hadn't said a word to you yet. He shook his head. I almost told her just to forget about it, to stay in the city and become pretty. She took a deep breath. Everything would have been so much easier if David had done exactly that. Tally would be pretty right now, high up in the party tower with Paris and Shay and a bunch of new friends at this very moment. But the image in her mind didn't give Tally the thrill it usually did. It just fell flat, like a song she'd heard too many times. David squeezed her hand. I'm glad I didn't. Something made Tally say, Me too. The words amazed her, because somehow they felt true. She looked at David closely, and the feeling was still there. She could see that his forehead was too high, and a small scar cut a white stroke through his eyebrow. But his smile was pretty crooked. Really. But it was as if something had changed inside Tally's head, something that had turned his face pretty to her. The warmth of his body cut the autumn chill, and she moved closer. Shay's tried hard to make up for chickening out that first time, and for giving you directions when she promised me she wouldn't, he said. Now she has decided the smoke is the greatest place in the world, and that I'm the best person in the world for bringing her here. She really likes you, David. And I really like her, but she's just not what? Not serious. Not you. Tally turned away, her head swimming. She knew she had to keep her promise now, or she never would. Her fingers went to the pendant. David. Yeah, I noticed that necklace. After your smile, it was the second thing I noticed about you. You know someone gave it to me. That's what I figured. And I told them about the smoke. He nodded. I figured that too. You're not mad at me? He shrugged. You never promised me anything. I hadn't even met you. But you still. David was gazing into her eyes, his face glowing again. Sally looked away, trying to drown her uncanny, pretty feelings in the sea of white weeds. David smiled softly. You let a lot of things behind when you came here. Your parents, your city, your whole life. And you're starting to like the smoke. I can tell. You just, you get what we're doing here in a way that most runaways don't. I like the way it feels here, but I might not stay. He smiled. I know. Listen, I'm not rushing you. Maybe whoever gave you the heart is coming. Maybe not. Maybe you'll go back to them. But in the meantime, could you do something for me? Sure. I mean, what? He stood, offering her his hand. I'd like you to meet my parents. And our next chapter is chapter 30, The Secret. They descended the ridge on the far side, down a steep, narrow path. David led her quickly in the darkness, finding footing on the almost invisible trail without hesitation. It was all Tally could do to keep up. The whole day had been one shock after another, and now, to top it all off, she was going to meet David's parents. This was the last thing she'd expected after showing him her pendant and telling him that she hadn't kept the smoke a secret. His reactions were different from those of anyone she'd ever met. Maybe it was because he'd grown up out here, away from the customs of the city. Or maybe he was just different. They left the familiar ridgeline far behind, and the mountain rose steeply to one side. Your parents don't live in the smoke? No, it's too dangerous. Dangerous how? It's part of what I was telling you your first day here, in the railroad cave. About your secret? How you were raised in the wild? David stopped for a moment, turning back to face her in the darkness. There's more to it than that. What? I'll let I'll let them tell you. Come on. A few minutes later, a small square filled with faint light appeared, hovering in the darkness of the mountainside. Tally saw that it was a window, a light inside glowing deep red through a closed curtain. The house seemed half buried, as if it had been wedged into the mountain. When they were still a stone's throw away, David stopped. Don't want to surprise them. They can be jumpy, he said, and then shouted, Hello! A moment later, a doorway opened, letting out a shaft of light. David? A woman's voice called. The door opened wider until the light spilled across them. It's David! As they drew closer, Tally saw that she was an old ugly. Tally couldn't tell if she was older or younger than the boss, but she certainly wasn't as terrifying to look at. Her eyes flashed like a pretty's, and the lines of her face disappeared into a welcoming smile as she gathered her son into a hug. Hi, Mom. And you must be Tally. Nice to meet you. She wondered if she should shake hands or something. In the city, you never spent much time with other Ugly's parents, except when you hung out at friends' houses during school breaks. The house was much warmer than the bunkhouse, and the timber floors weren't nearly as rough, as if David's parents had lived there so long their feet had worn them smooth. The house somehow felt more solid than any of the building in the smoke. It was really cut into the mountain, she saw now. One of the walls was exposed stone, glistening with some kind of transparent sealant. Nice to meet you too, David's mother said. Tally wondered what her name was. David always referred to them as Mom and Dad, words Tally hadn't used for Sol and Ellie since she was a littlie. A man appeared, shaking David's hand before turning to her. Good to meet you, Tally. She blinked, her breath catching, for a moment unable to speak. David and his father somehow looked alike. It didn't make any sense. There had to be more than 30 years between them, if his father had really been a doctor when David was born. But their jaws, foreheads, and even the slightly lopsided smile were also similar. Tally? David said. Sorry, you look the same. David's parents burst into laughter, and Tally felt her face turning red. We get that a lot, David said. You city kids always find it a shock. But you know about genetics, don't you? Sure, I know all about genes. I knew two sisters, Uglies, who looked almost the same. But parents and children? That's just weird. David's mother forced a serious expression onto her face, but the smile stayed in her eyes. The features that we take from our parents are the things that make us different. A big nose, thin lips, high foreheads, all the things that the operation takes away. The preference towards the mean, the dad said. Tally nodded, remembering school lessons. The overall average of human facial characteristics was the primary template for the operation. Sure, average-looking features are one of the things people look for in a face. But families pass on non-average looks, like our big noses. The man tweaked his son's nose, and David rolled his eyes. Tally realized that David's nose was much bigger than any pretty's. Why hadn't she noticed that before? And one of the things you give up when you become pretty. That's one of the things you give up when you become pretty. The family knows, his mother said. Why don't you turn up the heat? Tally realized that she was still shivering, but not from the cold outside. This was all so weird. She couldn't get over the similarity between David and his father. That's okay. It's lovely in here. Maddie, the woman said. Shall we all sit down? Az and Maddie apparently had been expecting them. In the front of the house, 4 antique cups were set out in little saucers. Soon a kettle began to whistle softly on an electric heater, and Az poured the boiling water into an antique pot, releasing a floral scent into the room. Tally looked around her. The house was unlike any other in the smoke. It was like a standard crumbly home, filled with impractical objects. A marble statuette stood in one corner, and rich rugs had been hung on the wall, lending their colors to the light of the room, softening the edges of everything. Maddie and Az must have bought a lot of things from the city when they ran away, and unlike Uglies, who had their own dorm uniforms and other disposable possessions, the two had actually spent half a lifetime collecting things before escaping the city. Tally remembered growing up surrounded by sold woodwork, abstract shapes fashioned from fallen branches. She would collect from the park as a littlie. Maybe David's childhood hadn't been completely different from her own. This all looks so familiar, she said. David hasn't told you, Maddie said. Az and I come from the same city as you. If we'd stayed, we might have been the ones to turn you pretty. Oh, I guess so, Tally murmured. If they'd stayed in the city, there would have been no smoke, and Shay never would have run away. David said you made it all the way here on your own, Maddie said. She nodded. I was following a friend of mine. She left me directions. And you decided to come alone? Couldn't you wait for David to come around? There wasn't time to wait, David explained. She left the night before her 16th birthday. That's leaving things until the last minute, Az said. But very dramatic, Maddie said approvingly. Actually, I didn't have much choice. I hadn't even heard of the smoke until Shay, my friend, told me she was leaving. That was about a week before my birthday. Shay? I don't believe we've met her, Az said. Tally looked at David, who shrugged. He had never brought Shay here? She wondered for a moment what had really gone on between David and Shay. You certainly made up your mind quickly then, Maddie said. Tally brought her mind back to the present. I had to. I only had one chance. Spoken like a true Smoky, Az said, pouring a dark liquid from the kettle into the cups. Tea? Please. Tally accepted the saucer and felt the scalding heat through the thin, white material of the cup. Realizing that this was one of those smoky concoctions that burned your tongue, she sipped carefully. Her face twisted at the bitter taste. Sorry, I've never had tea before, actually. Az's eyes widened. Really? But it was very popular back when we lived there. I've heard of it, but it's more of a crumbly drink. Um, I mean, Mostly only late pretties drink it. Tally willed herself not to blush. Maddie laughed. Well, we're pretty crumbly, so I guess it's okay for us. Speak for yourself, my dear. Try this, David said. He dropped a white cube into Tally's tea. The next time she drank, a sweetness had spread through it, cutting the bitterness. It was possible to sip the stuff now without grimacing. David's told you a little about us, I suppose, Mattie said. Well, he said you ran away a long time ago, before he was born. Oh, did he? Az said. The expression on his face was exactly like David's when a member of the railroad crew did something thoughtless and dangerous when a Vibrisol. I didn't tell her everything, Dad, David said, just that I grew up in the wild. You left the rest to us? Az said a bit stiffly. Very good of you. David held his father's gaze. Tally came here to make sure her friend was okay. All the way here alone. But she might not want to stay. We don't force anyone to live here, Mattie said. That's not what I mean, David said. I think she should know before she decides about going back to the city. Tally looked from David to his parents, quietly amazed. The way they communicated was so strange, not like Uglies and Crumblies at all. It was more like Uglies arguing, like equals. I should know what? She asked softly. They all looked at her, Mattie and Az measuring her with their eyes. The big secret, Az said, the one that made us run almost 20 years ago. One we usually keep to ourselves, Mattie said evenly, her eyes on David. Tally deserves to know, David said, his eyes locked with his mother's. She'll understand how important it is. She's a kid, a city kid. She made it here alone, with only a bunch of gibberish directions to guide her. Mattie scowled. You've never even been to a city, David. You have no idea how coddled they are. They spend their lives in a bubble. She survived alone for 9 days, Mom. Made it through a brush fire. Please, you two, Az interjected. She is sitting right here, aren't you, Tally? Yeah, I am, Tally said quietly, and I wish you'd tell me what you're talking about. I'm sorry, Tally, Mattie said, but this secret is very important and very dangerous. Tally nodded her head, looking down at the floor. Everything out here is dangerous. They were all silent for a moment. All Tally heard was the tinkle of Az stirring his tea. See, David said finally. She understands. You can trust her. She deserves to know the truth. Everyone does, Mattie says quietly. Eventually. Well, Az said, and then paused to sip his tea. I suppose we'll have to tell you, Tally. Tell me what? David took a deep breath. The truth about being pretty. And that's the end of the chapter for today. Tune in Monday to see what happens next. Have a great day.